Hi, Life Group leaders. This is Ken Gaines, and I hope you're ready to teach this week. We got a great lesson, and so we're just going to get right into it. Our lesson this week comes from 2 Kings 7, 1 through 15, but really covers the whole chapter. There's only 5 other verses, and it's called God Provides. And He certainly does, and we're going to find out in this lesson that He definitely took care of His people during this time, even though they had rebelled against Him, as so often happened in the Old Testament. Some incredible stories in these lessons that we're learning here in 1st and 2nd Kings. And we've got another doozy today with some crazy stuff that happens, and that's fun to talk about. But don't forget, God's got some lessons in here for us. So it's easy to get wrapped up in the stories and talk about them and why this happened and how do you think this went down. But don't forget the underlying lessons that we're supposed to get out of this. And at the end of this, I'll kind of summarize 3 things that I got out of the lesson as I read through it. So really, the lesson we have today, the tone for that was set in chapter 6. We learn that the Syrian or Armenian army under King Ben-Hadad has been camped outside the wall of Samaria, and they've not allowed any food or water to go in. And so this has gone on long enough now that the people in the city are now starving to death and extremely anxious. They've even resorted to cannibalism in some cases. So there's a lot of pressure on, and we know what happens to people sometimes when they get a lot of pressure on them. It's gotten so bad that at the end of chapter 6, the king of Israel, who is in Samaria because that's the capital at this time, this is likely Jehoram or Jehu. We're not sure which, doesn't say. But he's inside the walls. He's put on sackcloth. This event happened, which you can talk about or not, but he's vowed to God to kill Elisha since he blamed him for their predicament. And again, this shows just how a little bit of pressure can get put on someone in a leadership position and they make a really, really bad decision. And so all these things are happening, putting a lot of pressure on him. And so he vows to God to kill Elisha because of it. Now, we know why this is all happening to them. It's because they were worshiping idols. Same thing that happens over and over again, throughout this thing. And but he blamed Elisha for it. And how often do we try to project the cause of our own troubles on others when we may not be living for Jesus like we should? It's not always punishment from God whenever we have trouble in life, but troubles are always a great opportunity to reflect on our lives and humble ourselves before God. And that's probably what he should have been doing at this time. Instead, he's getting upset in front of all the people and saying he's going to kill Elisha, like that's going to make anything better. But anyway, that's what happened. And so we get to chapter 7 in our lesson, and at the beginning of this chapter, Elisha makes a prophecy. And he says, this time, by tomorrow, we're going to have so much food that people will be selling it for pennies on the dollar what you could buy stuff for at that time. And it talks a little bit about that in chapter 6, how this inflated prices. So we can all relate to that right now, right? And so the king and the captain have come to where Elisha is. And again, remember, the king wants to kill Elisha. And they hear this proclamation, and the captain, the king's second-hand man, he mocks Elisha, and he says, if God made windows out of heaven, this wouldn't even happen. So he's basically saying, this is impossible, you're a crazy old man. And, sometimes we're kind of like that maybe, especially when pressure's on, right? Do we sometimes limit God's ability because situations seem impossible? And God doesn't always work miracles for our good, like he's going to do here for Elisha, because he told Elisha he was going to. But we should never doubt that God controls everything, and He can do anything. And so that should never be a question in our mind. And whether we get to see that or not is irrelevant. Our faith should always be in Him. So, about the same time now, that's the first couple of verses there. About the same time now, we hear this other incredible story of these lepers. So there's 4 men who had leprosy that were at the gates, outside of the gates. They had been starving as well, and so they decided they were going to die if they didn't get something to eat, which was probably true. Since the Israelites wouldn't open the gate to them, they had no choice but to go and beg from the Syrians. These blokes reasoned that if the Syrians killed them, well, they were going to die anyway. So nothing ventured, nothing gained, right? And so they got up in the evening and they went to the Syrian camp. And what did they find? The camp was completely empty. The Lord had caused the Syrian army to hear thousands of horses and chariots round about them. And so the Syrians thought, these crazy Israelites have made a deal with the Hittites and the Egyptians to band together and come and slaughter them. And so they were so afraid that they immediately just took off and ran away, left everything. They thought they had almost no time to get away. So the lepers sat down, ate and drank, and were merry to their heart's content. And they actually started hoarding some of the plunder that they found. Then one of them said, "Hey, mateys, listen. This isn't right that we are indulging in all of this and leaving the people in the city starving to death." Now remember, they had been left outside the gates by the city. But they said, this isn't right, so we're going to go tell the guards what's happened. The Syrians are gone. Now, one question you might talk about, do you think the lepers decided on their own to go to the Syrian camp? Of course not. God is in control of all of this. God needed someone to go and find out that the Syrians had left, that He'd scared them all off, and so He chose these 4 lepers, right? And so throughout this, as we read it, we can see this miracle happening, whereas others may have seen it as just a incredible coincidence that turned out to be good. All right, so to finish up, the verses 11 through 20, the guards woke the king after they had heard this from the lepers and told them the story, but he said he didn't believe it. He said, this is a trick. The Syrians have left the camp, and they left it in disarray so that they could hide out on the perimeter, and when they all come out to look at it, then they're all going to jump out and slaughter them. And so, again, the king showing disbelief in an unusual way, but still, he gives no credence to what Elisha had said. Now, Elisha hadn't told him how this was going to happen, that they were going to have all this food. But it never even dawned on the king that this might be the way. And so here again, we see unbelief by the king because there's pressure. And it's only because there's pressure. If he'd have been more clear-headed and thought through this, he would have seen what was happening. Satan loves to put pressure on us, right? Because he distracts us from leaning on God. It's easy to do. It's easy to do when everything's going great, right? Yeah, I love God. He's so good. It takes a lot more faith when things aren't going so great, right? And so we need to remember that, though. God's always good. And so just because our situations may change and ebb and flow doesn't mean that God's not controlling things and God's not looking out for our benefit. Sometimes punishment can be benefit. So the king decides to check it out, though. So he sends a few riders. He says, hey, we're not all going out there, but I'm sending someone out. We're going to check this story out. The riders come back. They confirm. They say, hey, they are gone. We can't find any of them, within miles. And so, and all the camps intact. And so the gates were opened. The people ran to the camp to get the food. Again, they were starving, on death's doorstep. And they wanted to get all the gold, the riches, the clothes, everything that the Syrians had left there. Now, it just so happened that the king had told his captain to be in charge of the gate and say, hey, make sure all the people are orderly and all this stuff. Well, the people were so crazed with starvation, as soon as the gates were cracked, they became a mob and just rioted through the gate and stormed through it. And basically, the captain was trampled to death. And so Elisha's on a roll. Another prophecy comes true. Amazing. The captain knew the food was out there. He knew that they were saved, and yet Elisha's prophecy that he was not going to participate in it came true because he was killed in the rush to get to it, and so he did not get to partake in the victory of it because he didn't believe what Elisha said. He said, God can't fix this. And, sometimes we do that also. So I told you I've got three things out of this lesson to get, because we've got a lot of really neat stuff that happens here with Elisha and what he says. A lot of stuff happens in chapter 6 that you could talk about. And then the lepers here and their incredible story that happens to them. And then the prophecy about the captain and all of that. But what are we supposed to get out of this? So the first lesson I had is when we have tough times, it's a good time to reflect on humbleness and getting closer to God. It's not a time to get mad at those around us, to get upset about our situation, and to blame anything and everything. It's a time to reflect on, how are we living our life? How am I leaning on God? Am I leaning on God now for this? So that's one lesson I got out of it. Second lesson, for God's people, He always works for our good, whether we know it at the time or not. Note that punishment can be a good thing. And so, we're not always going to be, walking through the roses and having a great time in this life, but God loves us and He's going to take care of us. And then finally, the third lesson I have is when the pressure of life is on us and the sorrows of life get us down, we need to run to God instead of away from Him for true relief. His yoke is easy, right? The burden's light. That's only with God. We have hope in Him. He may not immediately take away our pain or our sorrow when we're down in the valley, but He is always there in the valley with us, and we have that hope. Unbelievers don't have that hope. And if we just remember that, remember many times in these lessons, God would put people in the valley so that they would come back to Him and lean on Him. And so that's what we need to do. We need to be Job. When everything's taken away, hey, I still have God, so I'm fine. And that's the attitude we should have. So as you work through all this information, there's lots of little rabbit trails to run down. But I think if you take those three lessons and you may come up with some more, those are the things that can be a comfort to us. And this is a great story for us to learn and use as we hit bumps in the road in our lives, and just remember, hey, what am I really living for? Am I really utilizing all the resources God's given me for His glory? And if not, maybe that's what I need to focus on. And whether God takes away the burden immediately or not, I can promise you it's going to be better. And so that's the lesson I got for this week. So the title was God Provides, and He absolutely does. And I think we just need to keep focusing on that, and things are going to be great. Remember, you're an heir to the kingdom, and nobody can take that away. So hope you have a good rest of the week and great discussion on Sunday, and that's all I've got. Thanks.